Do you want to learn how to play Anachrony?
In this video, we're going to take you through a concise explanation of the rules, and if you stay tuned till the end, we'll have some tips and strategies from the game's designer, David Turczi, coming up. Hi, it's Tarrant.
And Stella from Meeple University. Our passion is to clearly explain board game rules on videos. On our channel, we have a lot of playthroughs, vlog, overview, and how to play, just like this one.
So if you're new, please consider subscribing and clicking on the bell to get notified of our new content.
Now let's get to the rules.
It's the 26th century and it's 300 years since the apocalypse. Players play the roles of one of 4 factions of survivors who carry on life on Earth. The world has just discovered the secret of time travel and learned that a huge asteroid is coming to hit the Earth in a few years' time. In the game, players will be preparing for the impact by going out onto the Earth, gaining resources and workers, and building buildings in their own personal safe havens, gaining victory points for doing so. After the impact has occurred, the city starts to crumble, and players need to arrange to evacuate the Earth, gaining points based on their faction's specific evacuation criteria. But players are not alone. Because they've discovered the secret of time travel, players can ask their future selves for help, as long as they help their past selves when they get there. The faction with the most points after the entire city has crumbled, or after 7 rounds, whichever happens first, wins the game. I'm going to skip over main board setup, and I'll refer to a lot of the components as we get to them, but I'm going to take you through each individual player's setup. Each player takes a player board in his or her colour, and the players agree on whether they'll all use the identical A sides or the asymmetrical B sides. All players must use A's or all players must use B's. You cannot have a mix of both. Each player then takes a help card and all of the components in his or her player colour. 8 path tokens, 9 warp tokens, and 6 hexagonal exosuits. The original Kickstarter release of the game could also come with an upgrade pack in which these exosuits are miniatures. Each player takes a smaller double-sided path mat and randomly chooses either the A or B side. In this case, multiple players may have A's or B's in any mix. Your path sheet will show you your starting resources and workers. Starting workers may be allocated to begin either in the tired column or in the active column. And I'll discuss the implications of these 2 columns later on in the video. As an alternative to using the starting resources on the player board, players can agree to draft starting resource cards from this pack. Players are dealt the 2 leader cards for his or her faction and chooses one of them, placing them in this location. This will give the player another special power or ability that they'll be able to use during the game. The morale and time travel markers go on the matching starting spaces on their corresponding tracks. Finally, each player takes the banner of his or her faction. A first player is chosen, and that player puts the token on the main board. The second and third players in turn order, measured clockwise, gain 1 extra water, and the fourth player, if playing with 4, gains 2. Note that as part of setup, there'll be 2 important things on the board which will change for you from game to game, which will influence where you can get your victory points. There will be 5 common objective cards dealt near the board, and the player who has the most of whatever is printed on that card at the end of the game will gain 3 victory points. The other thing that each player has is an evacuation condition, and I'll talk more about how you'll score off this evacuation condition later in the game, but this gives you an objective that you will have to meet, and a second objective that you'll be trying to accumulate as many of the matching resources as you can. You're now ready to play. Each round of the game is played in 6 phases, which are indicated by these icons. And on other cards in the game, wherever you see one of these icons, that tells you which phase of the game that action can be taken. The major part of the game is Phase 5, and this is the worker placement and actions phase. This is what's going to take the longest in the game. The full sequence of each round is first there'll be preparation where new resources and workers are put on the board for access. The paradox phase, in which players who've been time travelling will suffer some consequences. The power-up phase, in which players are going to choose how many of their exosuits to power up, and this influences action selection. The warp phase, in which players will start time travelling. Then the actions phase, in which players will take all of their actions, and finally a clean-up phase. The game will play over a maximum of 7 rounds, which are tracked by these arrows. After the 4th round, the impact of the asteroid on the Earth will occur. And this is not a round in its own right, but it changes some of the rules and setup on the board, in ways that we'll talk about later. The end of the game will be triggered at the end of the 7th round, or earlier if the entire city has collapsed. And again, we'll talk about what that means later in the video. The first phase of each round is the preparation phase. This will set up the board for the next round. Firstly, sweep out any cubes from the mines and any workers from the worker track that have been left over from the previous round. Draw a mine card and place 1 cube of each of those types into these 5 spaces. Place a green, yellow and grey cube on these spaces. Similarly, draw a worker card and then place those types of workers onto the worker available spaces. Remove these cards as they're not needed any longer. Move all players' focus markers up to the arrow representing the current era. So if this were round 3, all tokens would be moved from wherever they are up to the 3rd arrow. Flip over the super project tile for the next era, so you'll always see which of these super projects is coming up 1 round in advance. Take the top tile from each of the 4 building stacks and place it onto the top of the 2nd pile for each of these stacks. The 8 face-up buildings will be the ones that are available to be built at the start of the round. You're now finished with the preparation phase. The second phase of each round is the paradox phase, and this is where you're going to take some penalties for having time travelled in previous rounds. And we'll come back to this phase once we've learned a bit more about time travel. You'll skip this phase in round 1. The third phase is the power-up phase, and this is where you'll be powering up your exosuits, which means to take them from your off-board supply and place them powered up onto your player board. In the game, the main board is a dangerous place, and every action that you take out there requires a worker to be protected inside an exosuit. And so in the power-up phase, you are choosing in advance how many exosuits you're going to power up, and therefore how many actions you intend to take on the main board. So in turn order, or simultaneously if you wish, players choose how many of their exosuits they're going to power up and move them to these spaces. Players have a maximum of 6 exosuits available. For each space covered which shows this icon, the player must pay 1 power core, and this means that the first 3 exosuits are free, while the next 3 will cost a power core each. Then, after completion, every hex that does not have an exosuit on it gains the player 1 water. Pay attention to that iconography. Anywhere that you see a resource in the game which is falling down into a hole, you are paying that resource to do the action. Anywhere you see a resource without that hole, you're gaining that resource. The fourth phase of each round is the warp phase, and this is the first time travelling element of the game. Say you need a gold and a green cube to do exactly what you want to do in this round. Because time travel now exists, the simplest thing to do is just ask your future selves for help. Your future self can gather those resources sometime in the future and then send them back to help you now. And that's what's happening in the warp phase. Players have 9 warp tokens available, and these are all of the resources that they can ask for from the future. Simultaneously, all players go through the warp tokens that they still have, that is, ones that aren't already out on the track, and choose 0, 1 or 2 of them simultaneously. All players then reveal and take those resources from the supply. If the player warps a worker, the player gains that type of worker on the awake side, but must pay 1 water to do so. If the player warps an exosuit, he or she gets another powered up exosuit without paying the cost of that hex. The warp tokens that they chose are placed onto the warp track in the current era. Warp tokens will remain on this track, meaning that that resource is unable to be warped again until a future time in the game where players build a power plant and a time machine and send those resources back to themselves. Successful time travelling will be worth victory points, and unsuccessful time travelling will cause paradoxes and lose victory points. But more on that later. The fifth and main phase of each round is the actions phase. Starting with the first player, whose standee will be on the board, each player will take it in turns to take one worker placement action at a time, going clockwise around the table until all players have passed. There are 3 types of worker placement space in the game. One shown with a large hex like this on the main board requires a player to take a worker from his or her active column, place it into an exosuit, and then place it on the board to take the action. Such a space has unlimited occupancy, so any number of exosuits and workers may be placed there. The second type of action space, also on the main board, is a single size hex. And in order to take an action at this location, the player must place a worker, again from the active column, into an exosuit and then place it into that space to take the action. These cannot be occupied by more than one worker. Some of these spaces require the player to pay water in order to use the space. The third type of action space simply shows the outline of a worker's shape without a hexagon around it, and these will be present on buildings and on the player's player board. To use such an action space, the player takes a worker, again from the active column, and places it into that space. Players may never use workers from their tired column to take actions. There are 4 different types of worker in the game: scientists, engineers, administrators, and geniuses. And as we'll see when we go through the specific actions, there are certain types of actions at which a specific type of worker is better. Geniuses are considered wild and will always get the benefit of whichever worker type is best at the action you're taking. In addition to taking a worker placement action, players also have some free actions available which are indicated by this circular action space. Prior to taking a worker placement action, the player may take 1 or more free actions, covering up the circle with one of the path tokens to indicate that the action has been taken. All of these will be cleared at the end of the round, and so while players can take as many free actions on a turn as they like, they can only take each free action once per round. Next, I'll talk about all of the different actions available on the main board. The first action space is the mine, and a player who visits the mine will gain 2 resources. The player may take any one of the available cubes from the left-hand column, and must take the cube from the right-hand column corresponding to the hex where he or she placed. Cubes are not replenished until the next round. All 3 types of worker can be sent to the mines, but the engineer, or a genius, has an advantage that he or she will come back motivated after the action. What does that mean? Well, normally when a worker returns from doing an action, that worker is placed in the tired column and is unable to be used again until being reactivated. But a worker which returns motivated goes straight back into the active column. We'll talk more about reactivating workers later in the video. The next action is to recruit, and a player who visits the recruitment space may recruit any one of the available workers from the column on the left. The worker that's recruited goes onto the active side of the player's player board, ready for use on subsequent turns, and the player also gains the bonus printed next to that worker. If the player recruits a genius, he or she may take any one of the above 3 bonuses. When taking a victory point bonus, the player gains a victory point token. Administrators are the best workers at recruiting. Engineers can also recruit, but they're not allowed to recruit geniuses, only the 3 basic types. Scientists cannot recruit. The next action space is research, and this can only be undertaken by a scientist, or of course a genius. The research action is where players can gain scientific breakthroughs, and these are worth points in their own right, or can be spent to build the powerful super projects available in the game. There are 15 different breakthroughs in the game, 3 different shapes and 5 different symbols. When doing research, the player sets either the shape die or the icon die to the side of his or her choosing and then rolls the other. The player then gains the corresponding breakthrough token. If the player rolls the question mark, then he or she may take any icon corresponding to that shape. If the player is choosing to set the icon die, he or she may not set it to the question mark side. The next action space is building, and this is where players will send their workers in order to construct building tiles or construct super projects. We'll discuss buildings first and then super projects. Buildings are these tiles, and they can occupy a single slot in the player's home base. There are 4 different types of buildings: power plants, factories, life support and labs, and each building type has its own designated row on your player board. The cost to build a building depends only on the slot in which you're placing that building, not on what the building is. And so to build a factory here would cost 2 titanium and 1 gold. The player would then choose one and place it into that slot. Buildings must be built from left to right and will get more expensive from left to right. All of the building slots require titanium to build. The lower rows require gold, uranium and water, and the top row, your power plants, which are involved in time travel, require the rarest element, neutronium, which is the purple cube. Buildings, when placed, will grant victory points that you count at the end of the game. They may grant you an extra free or worker placement action. Some buildings, which show no worker placement space, provides a bonus which makes a different action more powerful, and some tiles will give you a once-off bonus which is claimed as soon as it's built. All buildings have an index number, and you can refer to the appendix of the rulebook to learn exactly what each of them does. The other option when taking the build action is to build a super project, and those are these tiles shown above the arrows, which are generally worth many more victory points, which will occupy 2 slots, and which have some powerful in-game bonuses associated with them. A player can only build the super project corresponding to the location of his or her focus token. I'll talk more about focus tokens later because this is part of the time travel element of the game, but as a default it means you can only build this round super project, or if you've been focusing back in time, you can build a previous round super project which hasn't yet been built. But more on that later. The cost of a super project is shown in these 2 bars on the right hand side of the tile, and it's usually a high resource cost. It may cost you a worker, and it will cost you some scientific breakthroughs. So to build this, the player would spend 2 neutronium, 3 titanium, would lose 1 scientist, which can come from either the active or the tired side. You can consider it as that worker permanently being set to work in that station and not being available for anything else. And either the specific scientific breakthrough shown at the top, in this case a square chip, or any triangle and any circle. Then take the super project tile and place it into the leftmost available slot, choosing which row you want if there's a tie. The cost of the slots that you cover up is not paid. So, returning to the board, a single build action allows you to build either a building or a super project. You can do the build action with engineers or scientists, but not with administrators. If you build with an engineer or with a genius, then you get a 1 titanium discount on your build. The next 2 spaces are these ones, known as the World Council. When a player visits this World Council space, he or she must pay 2 water, but gets to take over first player for the next round. If a player visits this space, he or she would pay 1 water and would not get a turn order bonus. Then, from either of these spaces, the player may take one of these 3 actions below, as long as the player's worker meets the requirements of that specific space, and as long as all of the action spaces for that specific action are filled. This will be 3 hexes on the 4-player side of the board and 2 hexes on the 2 or 3-player side. So in this scenario here, the player would pay a water and then would be able to take the construction action. The player couldn't take the recruit action because it's not full, and couldn't take the research action because engineers can't do research. The purify water space allows a player to gain water. Sending an engineer or an administrator allows the player to take 3 water. Sending a scientist or a genius allows the player to take 4. And the trade with nomads action space allows a player to make trades of resources for other resources. Sending a scientist or an engineer allows a single trade, and sending an administrator allows 2 trades. A single trade allows trading 1 resource or set of resources 1 quadrant around this ring. So the player could trade 3 water for a power core or for 2 resource cubes, but could not trade it for a neutronium. The administrator, because he or she has an additional trade action, could make a trade all the way around the ring using both of those actions. Note that unless you have constructed a building which produces power cores, this is the only basic way in the game to get power cores. That concludes all of the actions available on the main board, and so now I'm going to talk about the actions that will be available on your player board and buildings. The first and most important is this section at the bottom of your player board where you manage your workers and their morale. As alluded to earlier, at the end of each round, when you retrieve your workers from the board, they will go into the tired space, unless they come back motivated. And from the tired column, they're not able to be used in actions. To move your tired workers to the active column, you need to take one of these 2 actions. The first is to supply your workers. In order to do this, take any worker and place it into this space. Because it's a worker placement action, this will take your entire turn. Then pay the amount of water corresponding to the current position on the morale track. So in this case, 5. You pay that water back to the supply, improve the morale of your personnel, and then move all of the workers over to the active side of the board. These will be available from future turns, and moving up the morale track will be worth points at the end of the game. Improving morale will cost more water the further you get up the track, and if you're already on the end of the track, you simply gain 2 victory point tokens for improving morale. If you send an administrator or genius to do this action, then he or she will come back motivated at the end of the round. Your alternative is to force your workers. This is a circle action space, so it's a free action, and you can take other actions on this turn. Place your path token onto that space, and then force all of your workers back to work without water. They will lose 1 step on the morale track. This will be worth negative points at the end of the game, and if you're already on the lowest space, you lose 1 worker in order to force them back in this manner. The other action spaces that you'll have available to you in the game are on the buildings that you've constructed. As mentioned before, some of these can be free action spaces and some can be worker placement spaces. There are some spaces which have restrictions on the type of worker which can occupy them, and some which require resources in order to activate. Life support buildings are primarily about gaining water. Factory buildings are primarily about gaining other types of resources. The lab buildings give you a bit of a mixed bag, and the power plants are all about time travel. And it's the time travel actions that I'm going to focus on next. Taking a power plant action occurs over 2 steps. Firstly, you will reset your focus. That's the marker that's underneath the era's track. Counting backwards from the current era, you may place your faction's focus token up to this number of spaces back. So in this case, up to 2 spaces back in time. This is always counted from the current era. So if a player later took this action, he or she would then have to go back to the current era and backward 1, rather than moving a further step backward from the current position. Then the player may optionally send 1 resource back in time to his or her former self. Pick a warp token of your colour from the era where your focus is now set, retrieve it, and then discard the corresponding resource. You have now successfully completed a time travelling loop. Move one step up the time travel track, which will be worth 2 victory points as a reward for doing so. If you're sending back a worker, that worker must come from the active side of your board. You received it active, so you must send it back active. Similarly, if you're sending back an exosuit, it must be a powered up, unused exosuit, similar to the one you gained when you warped it in. You now have this warp token back and will be able to warp that same resource to yourself on subsequent rounds. You can never warp something back to the current era. It must be to a prior era of the game. After you've completed the action, leave your focus marker in the era that you warped from, as this will allow you to build this super project on subsequent turns. After all players have passed in a given round, the actions phase is over and play proceeds to clean up. Players retrieve all of their workers from action spaces on the main board and action spaces on their player board, placing all of the workers into the tired column unless it came from an action space showing a return motivated icon. Exosuits are returned from the main board to the player's supply. Then check to see if the impact occurs or if the game is ended. And if these happen, proceed with those phases of the game. If not, and it's a normal phase, reset everyone's focus to the next era, and any powered up exosuits that are left over, that is, that weren't used, are also returned to the player's supply. Any effort spent powering them up was wasted. Then proceed to the next round. Now that we understand time travel, we'll go back and talk about the paradox phase. And this is phase 2 of each round, and this is where your efforts to time travel will come back and hurt you. In the paradox phase, look at each previous era in the game and determine who has the most or equal most warp tiles still left on it. For each tile where you have the most or equal most, roll the paradox die once. For each paradox symbol rolled, take a paradox token and place it up here at the top of your board. 4 sides of the die show 1, one side shows 2, and 1 is blank. Once all of the player's available spots for paradox tokens are filled, the player gains an anomaly. The player stops rolling the paradox die, even if there are more eras to roll from, and returns all paradox tokens to the box. Then take an anomaly tile and place it in the leftmost available space within your buildings. This will be worth -3 points if it's still present at the end of the game, and it occupies a space that a more useful building could fill. As a consolation for taking an anomaly, the player may retrieve 1 warp tile from anywhere in the past back to his or her supply, but the player will not gain time travel points for removing a tile in this way. Players can get rid of anomalies by spending any 2 resources or a neutronium, plus 2 water, and placing a worker, which will be removed from the game at the end of the round. After the 4th round is complete, the impact occurs, and some of the rules in the game are going to shift in the countdown to the finish. Take and shuffle the collapsing city hexes, which are these stacks of 5. You'll have 1 of these hexes on each of the action spaces here on the board. And then flip this board overlay over to reveal the destroyed side. Take the -3 victory point token and place it onto your player count. This introduces a new action space to the game, Evacuation, which I'll talk about soon. From this point forward, when you're filling up the mine, always ignore the top icon on the card and replace it with the purple neutronium. And on your player board, place these unavailable tokens onto these 2 spaces of the exosuits. From this point forward, you'll have at most 4 exosuits available per round, and 3 of them are going to cost power cores. So you'll need to make sure you have some power cores available for this phase of the game. The game has 2 major changes in the rounds after the impact. The first is the bonuses on the collapsing city tiles. When a player sends a worker out in an exosuit to do an action during the post-impact rounds, he or she will take a place which has one of these tiles, and this will give you an additional bonus. That means that all of these action spaces are significantly more powerful after the impact. However, after the players retrieve their workers at the end of a post-impact round, any spaces which were used are flipped over to the unavailable side. That part of the capital has collapsed and cannot be used again. So, as play proceeds to the 6th or 7th rounds, very few action spaces may still be left in these locations. Players may still use the World Council spaces to duplicate one of these actions, as long as all of the action spaces are unavailable, either through being occupied or having collapsed. At the end of the round, in which all of these action spaces have become unavailable, the game will end, even if it's short of the full 7 rounds. The second major feature after the impact is the evacuation action, and this is an important action which will net a player maybe 40 or 50% of their victory points, and so it's important that players plan for this and get it right. Each path board has an evacuation section which explains a prerequisite for evacuation and a condition which grants bonus points. In the case of this card, the player must have 3 grey buildings, the factories, in order to qualify for evacuation, and that would be worth 5 points upon evacuation. Then, for every pair of a titanium and an engineer that player has upon evacuating, he or she will gain an extra 2 points. To take the evacuation action, the player can use any type of worker and requires a powered up exosuit. The player then moves up there, places his or her path token onto one of the spaces running from top to bottom, and claims his or her evacuation points. So in the example we saw before, the player meets the criteria to evacuate, which is having 3 factories, and gains 5 points for doing that. Then the player has 5 titanium cubes and has a total of 4 engineers, counting up any that are in action spaces, that are active, or that are tired. Therefore, the player has 4 pairs of a titanium and an engineer and gains 2 points for each, for a total of 8 additional points. The player does not have to relinquish any of these resources, the player simply scores the points for having them. The maximum number of points a player can gain through evacuating is 30, and the minimum is 0. Whichever player is last to evacuate takes the -3 points marker, which reduces 3 points from the evacuating score. Each player may evacuate only once during the game. However, the player's game is not over upon evacuation. The player may continue taking actions, building buildings, completing time travel, and doing other actions to gain points even after evacuating. Timing your evacuation is one of the most critical decisions in the game. You can evacuate as soon as the impact has occurred, but if you do that, you might be missing out on some extra time where you can get more evacuation bonuses. But if you hold out and try to gain further bonuses, and someone ends the game, then you may miss out on evacuating entirely, which will cost you a lot of points. At the end of the 7th round, or the round in which all of the city tiles have collapsed, the game is over and proceed to endgame scoring. The final score can be calculated using this score pad. First, score your buildings area, gaining all the points shown in the bottom corner for buildings, shown in the top corner for super projects, and losing 3 points for each leftover anomaly. Add the points for your final position on the time travel track and on the morale track. Score any leftover scientific breakthroughs. These are worth 1 point each, and 2 points for every set of a triangle, square, and circle, even if the icons don't match. So this full collection would be worth 8 points. Score any victory point tokens that you've collected during the game, which will include those for the evacuation. Next, look at any of your warp tiles that are still located on the arrow track. If you have the corresponding resource, you can pay that back now without activating a power station, but you don't get any time travel points for it. If you do not have the resource to pay it back, lose 2 points for every such warp token. Finally, score the 5 objective cards which were dealt out at the start of the game. The player or players who has the most of whatever is on the card gains 3 points, with ties being friendly. The player with the highest score wins, and in the event of a tie, whoever has the most leftover water wins. If still tied, leftover resources, and if still tied, victory is shared. The game optionally comes with the Doomsday Module, which can be put onto the base game and gives players control over when the impact occurs. To set up the Doomsday Module, place the Doomsday board next to the main board with its 2 dice, and place the Save Earth and Seal Fate tokens into these central spaces. Set the impact marker after round 5 instead of round 4, and deal 1 level 1 experiment card into each era, similar to the super projects. Note that I haven't shown the super projects here for space, but those are still in the game as well. Return any other level 1 experiment cards to the box and shuffle the level 2 experiments ready for later in the game. During the preparation phase of each round, that is phase 1, you will flip over the level 1 experiment card for the next era. And if there are any eras which are empty, you will draw a level 2 experiment card and place it in its place. Then, during the actions phase, there is one new action available, the Perform Experiment action. This is a multi-hex space. It requires an exosuit, but any type of worker can use it equally. To perform this action, the player first completes the experiment in the same era as the player's current focus. So, in the same manner as building a super project, players can perform earlier experiments by using a power plant to reset their focus. To conduct an experiment, the player must meet the prerequisite shown in the left-hand box of that experiment, and then pay the cost shown in the right-hand box. So in this case, have any scientific breakthrough with the matching icon, and pay 1 resource. The player then takes the cards and gains the number of victory point tokens shown in the top right corner. After performing the experiment, the player moves either the Save Earth or the Seal Fate marker 1 step on its track. The blue and green factions are trying to save the Earth, and so if one of these factions performs an experiment, the Save Earth marker moves up 1 step. The yellow and red factions are trying to seal the fate of the Earth, and so move the Seal Fate marker 1 step down. If your faction makes a move, and there's victory points shown on your side of that track, gain the shown number of victory points. So if blue had made this move, blue would gain 1 point, but since green made the move, no points are gained. At the end of each round, when checking for impact, roll these 2 dice. These show 2 pluses, 2 minuses, and 2 blank sides. To this result, add the number of pluses or minuses to the right of the current location of these 2 markers. If there are more minuses than pluses, the impact is moved 1 era closer. If there are more pluses than minuses, move the impact 1 era forward. If there is an equal number of pluses and minuses, then the impact does not move. If moving the impact would bring it to before the current era, don't move the impact and simply resolve the impact now. If the Seal Fate marker has reached the bottom of the track, then resolve the impact at the end of the current round, irrespective of anything else. And finally, if the Save Earth marker reaches the top of this track, then the impact will not occur, and the game will end at the end of the current round. This can have a significant influence on the game because any players who've been working towards their evacuation points will no longer have a chance to gain those points. Note that only one of these 2 conditions can be met in the game. Once one has been reached, the other marker cannot move into its final space. Players can continue conducting experiments after this track has reached its end in order to gain the victory points, but they won't gain any additional movement or bonuses off the track. The game also comes with a solo mode in which players compete against an automa, which is controlled by this board, and the roll of a die. We won't go through the full rules of this mode in this video.
And let's have to play Anachrony.
Now we have a special guest, the game's designer, David Turczi, to give you some tips and strategies on how to play this game.
Hi, this is David Turczi, and I'm the lead designer of Anachrony, and I'm here to give you some strategy tips on how to play Anachrony well. The first thing I would want to point out is that while Anachrony is obviously a worker placement game at its core, the worker placement isn't the goal. It's the tool you do to get the best player board, the best path built. So think of it more of as a tableau building game than a worker placement game. Your goal is not to snipe the best possible action from the other player, because all actions, especially the capital actions, are good, whether it's getting a genius or building cheaper or researching cheaper. You will want to do each and every one of them. What you have to decide is which action gets you closer to building up a combo of abilities on your player board, where without any impediment from the other players you can keep running it from era to era and scoring points from the back of it without anybody being able to stop you, and being able to do that besides doing the worker placement game from turn to turn. The other advice I often want to give is new players ask me, what about the time travel? You're just borrowing things and then paying them back and getting some victory points. Why would I go through that trouble? Can't I just ignore time travel? Well, the answer to that question is yes, of course you can ignore the time travel, and if you do that, then a competent player will beat you by about 20 points or so. First of all, because you're missing out on very easily attainable 6 to 10 points on the time travel track, and more importantly, because time travel is tempo. The game is pure tempo control when it comes to that. Just think of it. You decide on turn 3 that you want to build your favorite building, and you're missing 2 resources for it. So you could go to the mine, get those resources, and then go to construct and build a building. But if everybody else constructed on their first turn, then it will cost you at least 1, possibly 2 water to construct, and you'll be 1 turn behind on all the other urgent actions. Whereas if you warp in the cubes, build the building, and the next turn send those cubes back, then you've done the same sum amount of actions, got 2 victory points more, and never fell behind in tempo. So remember, Anachrony is all about being in control of time, of your tempo, if you will, and a tableau building where you have to maximize the combo you can build and the things you can score. Thank you very much for watching.
Thanks, David, for the tips. Well, we hope that you enjoyed the video, and we hope that you enjoyed playing.
If you'd like to see the game in action to get a flavour for how it flows, we've got a 1-round playthrough video, and you can check that out by clicking on the link in the description.
Or if you like this video, please consider hit the like button. And if you have any questions, comments, feedback, write in the comment sections below. And if you are like us, we have a Facebook group, Meeple University Community, to share our loves of board games, so consider checking that out.
And finally, if you'd like to be among the first to be notified on what's new from Meeple University, please consider subscribing to our channel. You can click on the Meeple up in the corner, and do hit the bell button to get notifications.
Until next time.